The first time Opal Baker saw her name carved into a fence post, she thought she had imagined it. She had been traveling for 11 days straight from St. Louis, Missouri, crammed into a stagecoach that smelled of leather and old tobacco and the particular sourness of too many bodies pressed together through the heat of a Kansas summer. It was the year 1874, and the territories west of the Missouri River were still raw and unfinished, and the roads that cut through the grasslands were little more than ruts pressed into the earth by wagon wheels that had passed before. Opal Baker was 24 years old, and she had spent the last 3 of those years working as a seamstress in a city that had slowly suffocated her. And now she was riding toward a place called Caldwell, Kansas, which sat at the edge of everything civilized, and she was going there because her older sister Ruth had written her a letter that said, simply, "Come out here, Opal. There is more sky than you have ever seen in your life," and somehow that had been enough. The stagecoach lurched and groaned, and Opal pressed her forehead against the window glass and watched the flat golden land roll past her like an ocean she could never quite reach. The other passengers had stopped trying to make conversation 2 days ago, which suited her fine. She was not a woman who filled silence with noise. She had dark hair that she kept pinned up against the heat, and green eyes that her mother had always called serious, and hands that were slightly calloused from years of needlework, and she carried with her one large trunk and a smaller bag, and a sense of purpose that she had not entirely figured out yet. It was late afternoon when the coach slowed near a stretch of fencing that ran alongside the road. The driver called something down from his seat, something about watering the horses, and the passengers shifted and groaned, and Opal opened the door and stepped out into the Kansas wind, which hit her like something alive, warm and constant and smelling of dry grass and distance. She walked a little ways along the fence to stretch her legs. The posts were old wood, sun-bleached and cracked, and she trailed her fingers along the top rail as she walked. And then she stopped. There on the 4th post from where the coach had parked, carved deep into the grain of the wood, were 2 words, Opal Baker. She stared at it. The letters were deliberate and clean, carved with care, the kind of carving that took time and intention. She looked around her. There was nothing out here but grass and sky and the distant rumble of the coach driver talking to his horses. She looked back at the post. Her name, her full name, out here in the middle of nowhere on a fence post on a road she had never traveled before. She told herself it was a coincidence. Opal was not an uncommon name. Baker was certainly not an uncommon name. Someone had carved this, probably a long time ago, for reasons that had nothing to do with her. She walked back to the coach with her heart beating just slightly faster than it should have been, and she said nothing to anyone. Ruth was waiting for her in Caldwell, standing in front of the general store on the main street with her baby on her hip and her husband Thomas beside her. And when Opal climbed down from the coach, Ruth let out a sound that was half laugh and half sob and wrapped her free arm around Opal so hard that the baby squawked in protest. "You made it," Ruth said, pulling back to look at her. Ruth was 28 and had been out west for 3 years, and it showed, not badly, but she was browned from the sun in a way she never had been incensed. Louis and her eyes were easier, less pinched. "I made it," Opal agreed. Thomas Hale was a good man, solidly built, with a quiet smile and a handshake that told you everything. He took Opal's trunk without being asked and loaded it onto his wagon, and they drove out of town along a road that cut through more golden grassland toward the small homestead where Ruth and Thomas had built something out of almost nothing. That first night, over supper, Ruth talked about the land and the people and the rhythms of life out here, and Opal listened and ate and felt something in her chest beginning to unwind. Some tightness she had been carrying so long she had forgotten it was there. "There is a ranch," Thomas said near the end of the meal, "about 4 miles south of us. The Norris place. Good land, good operation. Isaiah Norris runs it. He has been running it alone since his father passed 2 winters ago. He is a fair man, good to his workers. I have done some trade with him." "Why are you telling me this?" Opal asked. Ruth and Thomas exchanged a glance that was just a fraction too quick. "No reason," Ruth said cheerfully and changed the subject. Opal filed this away and said nothing. She settled into her sister's life with a natural ease. There was plenty of work to be done, as there always was on a homestead, and Opal was not afraid of work. She helped with the cooking and the mending and the gardening, and she helped Ruth with the baby, whose name was James and who was 8 months old and regarded everything with enormous dark eyes as if the world were continuously surprising him. In the evenings, when the work was done and the light was long and golden, Opal would sit on the porch and watch the sky change colors over the flat land, and she understood what Ruth had meant in her letter. There was more sky here than she had ever seen in her life. On the third day, she walked out along the road that ran south from Thomas's property, just for air, just to feel the ground under her feet and the wind on her face. The road was bordered on one side by a long run of fencing, old posts and wire strung between them, and she walked along beside it with no particular destination in mind. She almost missed it. She would have missed it if the sun had not been at just the right angle to throw the carved letters into shadow. But she saw it, and she stopped so quickly that she nearly stumbled. Opal Baker. There it was again. Same careful letters. Same deep carving, as if whoever had done it had wanted to make sure it lasted. She looked up and down the road. No one. She looked at the post, at the grain of the wood, at the way the letters sat in the center of the post with what could only be called intention. 2 different fence posts, 2 different locations, both saying her name. A cold, curious feeling moved through her that was not quite fear and not quite thrill, but something in between, something she didn't have a word for. She walked back to Ruth's house and went about her evening as if nothing had happened, because she had not yet figured out what it meant, and she had always believed that silence was a better tool than noise until you understood what you were dealing with. That Sunday, Thomas drove them all into Caldwell for church and afterward for supplies. The town was a particular kind of alive that frontier towns were, always on the edge of itself, the saloons and the general store and the land office all existing in a kind of necessary tension. Opal walked beside Ruth along the main street while Thomas dealt with business, and she looked at the people who passed and tried to understand this place through its inhabitants. A man tipped his hat to her near the post office. He was perhaps 50, sun-weathered, with the look of a man who had been riding horses since before he could read. Ruth said quietly as they walked on, "That was Hector Crane. He is harmless, but he gossips like a church organist. Everything you say to him will be all over town by nightfall." Opal smiled. "Good to know." Later, near the livery stable, Thomas stopped to talk to a man whose back was to them. He was tall and lean, with shoulders that carried themselves a particular way, the way of men who did physical labor not because they had to prove something, but because the work was simply there and they did it. He wore a dark hat and his shirt was rolled to the elbows, and his hands were brown from the sun. When he turned to include Thomas's party in the conversation, Opal saw his face. He was perhaps 27 or 28, with a jaw that was clean-shaved and dark eyes that were quick and careful at the same time, the kind of eyes that notice things. He was not handsome in the way that city men tried to be handsome. He was handsome in the way that the land was handsome, by being exactly and entirely what it was. "Isaiah," Thomas said, "you have not yet met my sister-in-law. This is Opal Baker, just arrived from St. Louis. Opal, this is Isaiah Norris." Isaiah Norris looked at her for a moment with those careful dark eyes, and something moved across his face that she could not name, some brief, controlled thing, before he extended his hand. "Miss Baker," he said. "Welcome to Caldwell." "Thank you," she said. His handshake was the same as his eyes, careful, present. There was a beat of silence that was not uncomfortable but was somehow significant, and then Ruth was talking about something and Thomas was nodding, and the moment folded back into ordinary conversation. But Opal watched Isaiah Norris for the next few minutes of pleasantries, and she noticed that he did not say very much, and what he said was direct, and he looked at people when they spoke to him as if what they were saying actually mattered to him. When they parted, He touched the brim of his hat and said it had been good to meet her, and Opal said the same, and they went their separate ways, and she thought about her name carved into two different fence posts and wondered. That evening after supper, she asked Thomas casually how long Isaiah Norris had had his ranch. Thomas considered this. His family homesteaded out here about 15 years back, when Isaiah was just a young boy. His father built the ranch and Isaiah grew up working it. Passed it to Isaiah when he died. Isaiah has expanded it considerably since then. And his mother, Opal asked, died when he was young, 8 or 9, I think. Thomas paused. He is a good man, Opal. I mean that plainly. She looked at her brother-in-law. I know you do. She did not sleep easily that night, but it was not an unpleasant sleeplessness. The following week, she found the third post. She had been walking the ridge road that looped north from Thomas's property and came back around through a stretch of open land that Thomas said belonged to no one in particular, just territory grass, and she had been walking for the pleasure of it. The way the morning air was cool before the sun got high, and she was thinking about nothing in particular when she saw it. This post was at the corner of a fence section, a heavier post than the others, planted deep, and the carving on it was on the side facing the road. She stood in front of it and read her own name and felt the curious thing again, that not fear not thrill, and added to it now was something warmer. She ran her finger along the letters. The carving was not new. It was weathered enough to have been done some weeks ago, maybe more, which meant whoever had done this had done it before she arrived. Before she arrived in Caldwell. She turned around in the road and looked at the lay of the land and tried to work out what she knew. The first post had been on the road from Wichita, where the stagecoach had stopped. The second had been on the road south of Thomas's property, which Thomas had said went to the Norris ranch. The third was here, on this ridge road. A man who had known she was coming had been riding the roads around this territory and carving her name into the fence posts. That was what she knew. That was what the evidence said. Opal Baker was a practical woman. She did not romanticize things before she understood them. But she stood in that road with the morning wind moving her hair against her cheek and her finger resting against those carved letters, and she felt something she had not felt in a very long time, something she had nearly convinced herself she did not need. She walked back to the house and said nothing to Ruth or Thomas. She needed to understand it first. She needed to find the rest of them. She began to look for them deliberately after that, though she kept this to herself. She took her walks with more purpose now, going farther and in different directions, and she found the fourth post 2 days later on the East Road, near a creek crossing. She found the fifth one the day after that, on a fence line that ran along the southern boundary of Thomas's land and then continued onto what must have been the northern boundary of the Norris property. Each post was the same, deliberate, careful. Her full name, Opal Baker, cut clean and deep into the wood. She had found 5 of them and she had not yet said a word. On a warm Thursday afternoon, 3 weeks after she had arrived in Caldwell, Opal was hanging laundry in the side yard when she heard hooves on the road and looked up to see Isaiah Norris riding in on a sorrel horse, sitting easy in the saddle the way only men who had ridden all their lives could manage. He was wearing his dark hat and his expression was its usual careful, present thing, but when he saw her looking at him, something happened around his eyes that she had been watching for. He pulled up at the gate. Thomas came out of the barn. "Isaiah," Thomas called, "come on in." Isaiah dismounted with the easy economy of a man who never wasted movement, and he tied his horse to the post and came through the gate, and Thomas shook his hand and they talked about cattle for a few minutes, and Opal went on hanging laundry and listened. "You are welcome to stay for supper," Thomas said. "Ruth would be glad of it." Isaiah looked toward the house and then his eyes moved to Opal again, just briefly, just for a moment. "I appreciate that," he said. He stayed for supper. He sat across the table from her and ate Ruth's venison stew and talked with Thomas about the price of beef in Wichita and the state of the cattle trails, and a dispute between 2 neighboring ranchers over water rights that had been going on for 2 years and showed no sign of resolution. He asked Ruth about the baby, and he asked Ruth about whether she had gotten the seed order she had been waiting for. And he asked these questions with genuine interest, not politely but actually. At one point Ruth said, "Isaiah, did you know that Opal is a seamstress? A very good one. She has already done mending for half the women in town." Isaiah looked at Opal. "Is that so?" he said. It was not exactly a question. "I enjoy the work," Opal said. "There is a satisfaction to making something useful," he said. "There is," she agreed. It was not a long exchange. But it was the first time they had spoken to each other directly. Just the two of them aimed at each other. And Opal felt the warmth of it even after the conversation had moved on. When he left that evening, he thanked Ruth for the meal and shook Thomas's hand, and then he looked at Opal and touched his hat, and she said it had been good to have him, and she meant it, and she thought she could tell that he knew that she meant it. The next morning she found the 6th post. She had not been looking for it. She was walking the track that ran along the creek, the one that Thomas sometimes used to haul water, and she was watching a red-tail hawk riding thermals high up in the blue sky, and she nearly walked into the fence. The creek track ran along the back of a long fence line, and the post where the track passed through a gate was right in front of her, and there it was. Opal Baker. She stood and looked at it for a long time. 6 posts. 6 declarations carved into the land itself, into the bones of this territory, put there before she had arrived, as if someone had been preparing the ground for her. As if someone had been writing her into the story of this place before she knew she was going to be a part of it. She put her hand flat on the post, palm over the letters, and she closed her eyes and stood there in the morning with the creek moving softly beside her and the wind in the cottonwood leaves overhead, and she felt something settle in her chest like an ember settling deeper into ash. Then she opened her eyes and went home and baked a pie. Ruth watched her flour the board and asked, "What are you thinking about?" "Nothing," Opal said. Ruth made a face that said she knew that was not true. "When did you tell Isaiah I was coming?" Opal asked, keeping her eyes on the pastry. Ruth went very still for just a moment. "Oh, I wrote him sometime in late spring," she said with a casualness that was just slightly too practiced. "When I wrote to you, I mentioned it to a few people. You know how it is." "Late spring," Opal said. "That would have been about 8 weeks before I arrived." "I suppose so, yes," Opal said, and kept rolling the pastry. Ruth did not say anything else, but Opal could feel her watching. That evening, Ruth found an excuse to send Thomas over to the Norris ranch with a jar of preserves, which was the most transparent thing Opal had ever seen. And Thomas went without question because he was either innocent of the scheme or had decided that being helpful was more important than being subtle. Opal sat on the porch with the baby in her lap and looked at the sky going orange over the flat land and thought about a man who had ridden the roads around this territory in the weeks before she arrived and carved her name into the fence posts. She thought about what kind of man did a thing like that. Not a bold man, not in the ordinary way. Not the kind of man who went up to a woman and announced his intentions with a speech. No. The kind of man who did something like this was the kind who felt things so deeply and quietly that they spilled out in actions rather than words, who expressed himself through his hands, and through the land he knew better than anything else, who had heard she was coming and had not been able to keep it contained, and had done the only thing he knew how to do, which was to work with his hands and mark what mattered. She thought that was quite possibly the most remarkable thing she had ever known about a person, and she had not said a single word about it yet, and she was not sure when she would, and she was not sure what she would say when she did. Thomas came back from the Norris ranch with an empty jar and a message that Isaiah had invited them all to Sunday dinner. Ruth accepted before Thomas had finished relaying the invitation. Sunday came in hot and bright, the way August days in Kansas did, with the sky a hard, brilliant blue and the grass so golden it looked burnished. Thomas drove them in the wagon, Ruth beside him with the baby, Opal in the bed of the wagon with her back against the side and her face turned up to the sky. They drove south along the road she had walked, past the fence post where she had first seen her name on this stretch of land, and Opal's eyes lingered on it as they passed, but she did not turn her head. The Norris ranch was more substantial than she had expected. The main house was solidly built of lumber and stone, with a wide porch running the full length of the front, and a kitchen garden beside it that was well tended and green. There were 2 barns, large ones, and several smaller outbuildings, and the fencing was in good repair, which told her something about the man who owned it. The cattle in the south pasture were good stock, healthy-looking, moving slowly in the heat. Isaiah came out to meet them as Thomas pulled the wagon into the yard. He was wearing a clean shirt, white, with his sleeves rolled down for company, and his hat was in his hand. He helped Ruth down from the wagon seat and greeted Thomas and shook his hand, and then he turned to help Opal down from the wagon bed, and when she put her hand in his, she felt the roughness of his palm against hers, the calluses of honest work, and she looked up and found his dark eyes on her face, and she held his gaze for just a beat longer than politeness required. He did not look away either. "Welcome," he said. "I am glad you could come." "So am I," she said. There was a woman named Clara Beckett who worked as Isaiah's cook, a widow of 50 or so with gray in her hair, and a warmth that filled whatever room she occupied. She had made a roast and corn and biscuits and a blackberry cobbler, and they ate at the long table in the kitchen because it was too hot for the dining room, and the meal was good and easy, the conversation moving the way good conversation did, without anyone pushing it. After dinner, Isaiah showed Thomas the new section of the south pasture he had fenced in the spring, and Ruth took the baby inside with Clara, and Opal wandered out of the house alone and stood on the porch looking at the land. She heard his boots on the porch boards behind her. She did not turn around. "It is a good piece of land," she said. He came and stood beside her, not too close, and looked out at what she was looking at. "It has been good to me," he said. They stood like that for a little while. The wind moved the grass in long, slow waves. A meadowlark was singing somewhere out of sight. "I have been taking walks," Opal said, "since I arrived." "Thomas mentioned you liked the mornings," he said. She turned to look at him. He was looking at the land still, his profile clean against the sky. "I have been walking all the roads around my sister's property," she said. "The South Road, the Ridge Road, the Creek Track." He was very still. "The road from Wichita," she added. He turned then and looked at her. She held his gaze. There was a long moment of silence between them, and it was not uncomfortable. It was the opposite of uncomfortable. It was the kind of silence that has weight and warmth, the kind that means something is being said that words are not adequate for. "I heard you were coming," he said finally. "Ruth wrote. She talked about you, about what you were like." He paused, and the pause was full of something. "I do not know that I can explain it." "You do not have to explain it," she said. He looked at her for another moment and then looked back at the land. "I am not a man who talks a great deal," he said. "I had noticed," she said. She thought she saw the edge of a smile, just the edge. "When Ruth wrote about you, she said you were serious and quiet and that you had green eyes and that you had wanted to come west for years but had not found the right reason." He stopped. "I thought about that you were waiting for the right reason." Another pause. "I started writing the roads. I am not sure what I was thinking. Only that I wanted you to know when you arrived that there was someone here who had been thinking about you coming." Opal looked at the fence line running south from the porch, and she thought about her name carved into those posts, her name in this man's handwriting burned into the wood of this land, and she felt the warmth she had been carrying in her chest since the first post she had found expand suddenly and completely. "I found 6 of them," she said. "7, he said. "There are 7. I have not found the 7th. "It is on the gate post at the north entrance to the ranch," he said, "where the main road comes in." She thought about that. She thought about how she had come in through the gate today, on the wagon, looking at the house and not at the posts. "I should have looked," she said. "You will have other chances to look," he said. She turned toward him, fully this time, and he turned toward her, and the afternoon light was on his face, and she could see the careful hope in his dark eyes, the way he held himself both open and braced, the way a man who has put something precious out into the world waits to see what becomes of it. Isaiah, she said, and saying his name felt like something she had been practicing for without knowing it. I think that is the most quietly extraordinary thing I have ever heard. Something happened in his expression then, something releasing, something warm coming up behind his eyes, and he said, "You did not say anything. All those walks. You found them and said nothing. I was not sure what that meant." "I was thinking," she said. "What were you thinking about?" "I was thinking about what kind of man does a thing like that, carves a woman's name into the land before she even gets there. I was working out who you were." He considered this. "And what did you decide?" She looked at him for a moment in the warm August light, at this man who had expressed something he probably could not have put into a letter by riding the roads at dawn and carving her name into the wood of this country. "I decided," she said, "that I was very glad I came west." The edge of that smile became a full smile, brief and real and completely transforming, and she felt the warmth in her chest reach her fingertips. They walked the fence line after that, just the two of them, side by side in the late afternoon sun, and he told her about the land, and she told him about St. Louis, and they talked easily and well. The way people talk when they have already moved past the formal and are simply discovering each other. And when they came back to the house, Ruth was watching from the kitchen window with an expression that Opal pointedly did not acknowledge. In the weeks that followed, Isaiah came to supper at Thomas and Ruth's twice, and Opal went to Sunday dinner at his ranch twice, and they took one walk together along the creek track with Thomas and Ruth theoretically present but somehow always quite far ahead or quite far behind. And in those walks and those suppers Opal learned more about who he was. He had grown up on this land, had learned everything he knew from his father and from the land itself. He had a kind of knowledge that was physical and deep, the knowledge of a man who had worked the same piece of earth for 20 years and understood its moods and its capacities. He read more than people might have expected, whatever books he could get from the circulating library that came through Caldwell twice a year on a wagon. He had opinions about things, strong ones, but he offered them without aggression, which she found she liked enormously. She learned that he had two hired hands who worked for him year-round. Eli, who was 22 and energetic and broke horses beautifully, and a man everyone called Old Pete who was somewhere around 60 and had been working cattle since before Kansas had been a state. She learned that Isaiah paid his men fairly, which she heard from Thomas, not from Isaiah himself, and that when a drought had hit 3 years ago, he had kept both men on at full wages while other ranchers in the territory had let their hands go. She thought about that. She thought about it quite a lot. She also found the 7th fence post. It was the Sunday she drove herself to the Norris ranch for dinner, in the small buggy Thomas let her borrow, and she came in through the main gate on the north road, and this time she was watching. She pulled the horse up at the gate and she got down from the buggy and she walked to the left-hand gate post, and there it was, facing the road, facing anyone who came down the north road toward the ranch, the largest and deepest carving of all. Opal Baker. She stood in the September morning and looked at it for a long time. This was the one he had put at his own gate, at the entrance to his own land. The one that said not just that he had been thinking of her on all the roads of the territory, but that he had claimed her presence here, at his home, from the beginning. She put both hands on the post, one on either side of the carving, and she looked at those letters for a long time, and something happened in her chest that she did not try to name. Then she heard his boots coming down the porch steps and she turned around. He was walking toward her across the yard, and he could see from the way she was standing at the gate post exactly what she had found, and he stopped a few feet away with his hands easy at his sides and looked at her. She looked at him. 7, she said. 7, he agreed. Isaiah, she said. Yes, he said. I believe, she said, that you ought to come calling. He looked at her for a moment and then he said, very simply, I believe I ought to. He came calling that evening, hat in hand, speaking to Thomas with the formality of a man who understood how things were done. And Thomas shook his hand with a kind of suppressed pleasure that was entirely unsubtle. And Ruth appeared in the doorway with the baby and a smile she was barely trying to control. And Opal stood in the middle of the room and let the formality of it happen around her and felt the warmth of being known by someone, truly known, before they had even spoken a dozen words. He sat with her on the porch that evening, just the two of them, while the last light left the sky, and they talked about things that mattered. He asked her if she missed St. Louis, and she said she missed her mother, who had died 2 years before, but not the city itself. She said she had felt for a long time like she was waiting for something she could not name, like she was in a room looking out a window at a country she could not get to, and coming west had been the first time the window had been open. He listened to this with his full attention. He did not try to tell her what she meant or to smooth over the feeling. He simply listened, and then he said, "I know what it is to be in a place and still feel like something is missing from it." She looked at him. "What was missing for you?" He looked at the dark horizon for a long moment before he answered. "Someone to share it with," he said. "This land, the way the light is in the morning, the first snow, the way the cattle come in the autumn. It is good and it is mine, but it is also very quiet." She thought about him riding these roads alone in the early morning, her name in his hands, carrying something that had no one to hold yet. "It is not as quiet now," she said. "No," he said, "it is not." After that evening, things moved with a naturalness that neither of them tried to hurry or slow down. He came to see her 3 times a week through September and into October, and sometimes they sat on the porch, and sometimes they walked, and sometimes they sat at the table and played cards with Thomas and Ruth while the wind came in under the door, and the baby slept in his crib in the next room. And in all of it, Opal felt herself becoming known by this man, in the way she had always wanted to be known, piece by piece, through attention and patience, not through grand declarations, but through the steady accumulation of care. He told her about his father, a man named William Norris, who had come to Kansas from Tennessee with a wagon and a plow, and a kind of faith in the land that Isaiah had inherited. He told her about how William had been fair and hardworking, and had treated the Kaw people whose land this had originally been with a respect that was not universal among the settlers of the territory, a fact that Opal held quietly and with weight. William had died of a fever in the winter of 1872, and Isaiah had stood at the edge of that grave in the frozen ground, and understood that the ranch was his now entirely, and that the silence it contained was his also. "He would have liked you," Isaiah said one evening in October, sitting on the porch with the first cold edge to the wind. "He liked people who thought before they spoke." "That is not exactly a compliment," she said. "From him it was the highest one," he said. She laughed. It was the first time she had laughed fully out loud with him, and she saw him react to it the way you react to unexpected music, with a kind of startled joy. "You have a good laugh," he said. "So do you when I can get one out of you," she said. He did laugh then, a real laugh, low and warm, and it was, she thought, one of the best sounds she had heard in a long time. Eli, the young hand at the Norris ranch, was a cheerful and transparent young man who had clearly decided that Opal was good for his employer, and who greeted her with enormous warmth every time she came to the ranch. Old Pete was more reserved, but he had begun acknowledging her presence with a nod that, by mid-October, had progressed to a 2-word greeting, which Ruth told her was the equivalent of a brass band welcome from Old Pete. Clara Beckett, the cook, was another matter entirely. Clara had been fond of Isaiah in a maternal way since his father died, and she regarded Opal with the particular scrutiny of a woman, deciding whether the person her charge has chosen is worthy of the choice. This scrutiny was rigorous and sometimes uncomfortable, but Opal did not back down from it, and by the 3rd Sunday dinner she and Clara had settled into a mutual respect that later became something warmer. "You are not a fool," Clara told her one afternoon in November while they were shelling beans at the kitchen table. "I try not to be," Opal said. "He needs someone who is not a fool," Clara said. He has a great deal of sense himself, and it is very wearing to be around people who have less sense than you." "I imagine it is," Opal said. "You will do well here," Clara said, and returned to her beans, and this was clearly the end of the assessment. In November, the weather changed. The first blue norther came down from the plains and hit Caldwell like a wall, dropping the temperature 20 degrees in an afternoon, and bringing a hard wind that found every gap in every wall and every doorframe. Ruth fussed over the baby and Thomas laid in extra wood, and Opal stood on the porch for a few minutes in it and felt the bigness of the weather and loved it completely. Isaiah came to see her 2 days into the cold spell, riding through the wind with his collar up, and when he came inside and Ruth took his coat and Thomas poured the coffee, he sat beside Opal at the table, and his arm was very close to hers, and the warmth of that nearness was better than the coffee. "There is something I need to ask you," he said to her quietly, under the cover of Ruth telling Thomas some story about a neighbor. She looked at him. "Ask me." He looked at his coffee cup for a moment and then at her. "I want to know if you are staying," he said, "in Caldwell. I know you came to visit Ruth. I know you did not necessarily come with any particular plan. I need to know what you are thinking about." She understood the gravity of the question. He was not asking about her plans for the week. He was asking whether the thing that had been growing between them had ground under it, or whether she was going to go back to St. Louis and take all of this warm, careful feeling with her and leave him with the quiet land and the fence posts. She looked at him for a long moment. The wind was hitting the side of the house in gusts, and the lamp on the table was burning steady, and his dark eyes were on her with that careful hope she had first seen on the porch of his ranch. "I'm not going anywhere," she said. He let out a breath that was very small and very controlled, but that she heard anyway. "Good," he said. And then after a beat, "I am glad." "So am I," she said. Ruth, across the table, was saying something to Thomas about the neighbor's chicken coop, and her eyes were not wandering at all in the direction of Opal and Isaiah, which was so uncharacteristic as to confirm that she had been listening to every word. December came in cold and gray, and the grassland went flat and brown, and the sky lowered itself, and the ranch work became the hard, particular labor of winter, keeping the cattle through the cold, keeping the water from freezing, keeping the fencing in repair against the ice that could split the posts. Isaiah was busy in the way that frontier farmers and ranchers were always busy in winter, which was a different kind of busy than the summer, less sweating and more enduring, but it was still hours and days of hard work. He still came to see her twice a week without fail. He came through mud and he came through cold, and once he came through a light snow that had made the south road treacherous, and when Opal opened the door and saw him standing there with snow on his hat and his horse tied at the post, she felt something so clean and certain in her chest that she did not know what to do with it for a moment. She simply stood there and looked at him. "You rode through that," she said. "I did," he said. "Come inside," she said. He had brought her something. He had been bringing her small things for several weeks now, nothing showy, nothing the way men in the city brought flowers and presented them with speeches, but quiet things, considered things. A book from the traveling library wagon. A piece of turquoise he had found in the creek bed, green-blue as her eyes. A jar of honey from a man in town who kept bees. Tonight he had brought a set of small carving tools wrapped in cloth. "I thought," he said, with slightly more care than usual, "that you might like to make something with these, if you have a mind to." She unwrapped them and looked at them. They were good tools, clean and sharp, the kind that took effort and cost to obtain in a territory town. "Isaiah," she said. "I know you so," he said, "but I thought perhaps there were other things you might like to make." She looked up at him. He was watching her with that expression she had come to know, the careful one, the one that gave nothing away except everything. "What kind of things?" she asked. He looked very slightly away and then back. "Whatever you like," he said. "You could carve your name into something if you wanted." She held the tools in her hands and felt the laugh rising in her before she let it out, warm and real, and she saw the smile come up on his face in response. "My name," she said, "Or mine," he said, "if you liked." "Isaiah Norris," she said, testing the sound of it in a particular way, and she felt him go very still. She looked at him, he looked at her. The lamp was burning between them, and the snow was falling softly past the window, and the house was quiet around them, and something had shifted in the air. Some last veil between them had lifted, and she thought, standing there with a set of carving tools in her hands, that she was entirely and irrevocably in love with this man. "Opal," he said. Her name in his voice was something different from her name everywhere else. "Yes," she said. "I would like," he said, and stopped and started again with the care of a man who does not say things he does not mean. "I would like very much to ask you to marry me." The fire was popping gently in the stove. Outside, the wind moved the snow across the road. "I would like very much," she said, "to say yes." What happened in his face then was not something she would ever forget. It was not dramatic, it was not theatrical. It was simply the expression of a man whose most careful and deeply held hope had just been met, the expression of a person arriving home. He took her hands in his, the carving tools between their palms, and he looked at her, and then he did something she had not expected from him, this quiet and contained man. He said, "I have thought about you every day since Ruth sent that letter. I had no right to, I had not met you, but I thought about you coming and I could not stop. I rode those roads in the mornings and I carved your name because I needed to do something with it. Because I needed you to be real on this land even before you were here." She thought she might cry, which was not a thing she did easily. "I am real on this land," she said. "You are," he said. "You are the realest thing on it." She stood on her toes and kissed him then, quickly and warmly, and felt his hands tighten on hers. And then they stood there in the lamplight in the house, full of the sound of the fire and the wind. And she thought that if she had never gotten on that stagecoach and ridden 11 days west through the heat of Kansas, and arrived in Caldwell with her trunk and her serious eyes and her life needing direction, she would never have known this specific happiness existed. Ruth appeared in the kitchen doorway with an expression that was entirely unconvincing in its attempt to seem surprised. "Well," Ruth said. "We are getting married," Opal told her. Ruth made the same sound she had made at the stagecoach stop when Opal arrived, half laugh and half sob, and she crossed the room and embraced them both at once, which was slightly undignified and entirely perfect. Thomas, who had been conspicuously absent from the parlor all evening, and who emerged from the direction of the back hallway with an expression that was too carefully neutral to be genuine, shook Isaiah's hand, and then pulled him into a brief hard embrace that made Isaiah blink with something like pleased surprise. They were married on the 14th of February, 1875, which was Ruth's idea, and which everyone else agreed to because it was February in Kansas, and there was not a great deal else to celebrate in February in Kansas. Caldwell's Reverend performed the service in the white clapboard church on the main street, and the whole town seemed to come, or at least the part of the town that counted, which was to say the people who had watched Isaiah Norris run his ranch alone for 2 years with a kind of dignified solitude that had made people fond of him and glad for this development. Clara Beckett sat in the front pew and produced a handkerchief before the service had properly begun, and used it throughout. Opal wore a dress she had made herself from ivory wool that she had ordered from a dry goods catalog in December, fitted at the waist and full in the skirt, with small buttons of carved bone down the back that she had spent 3 evenings finishing. She wore her hair down for the first time in Caldwell, and it fell in dark waves past her shoulders, and she saw Isaiah's face when he turned to watch her come down the aisle, and she held his gaze the whole length of the church. He was wearing a good dark suit that she suspected Clara had pressed 4 times that morning, and his dark eyes were bright in a way she had not seen before, open and full of something she was by now entirely familiar with because she felt it herself. They said their vows in the clear, cold light of a February morning, and Opal said yes with the same certainty she had brought to everything that mattered in her life, steady and true. And when the Reverend said it was done, Isaiah took her face between his rough hands and kissed her in front of the whole congregation, and Eli let out a whoop from the back that was technically inappropriate and perfectly right. There was a gathering at Thomas and Ruth's house afterward, because their house was larger and Ruth had been planning the food for 3 weeks. There was music, a fiddle player and a man with a harmonica who knew enough songs between them to keep the room moving, and there was dancing on the cleared floor of the parlor, and Clara had made a cake with actual sugar icing, which was an occasion in itself. Old Pete drank 2 glasses of whiskey and told Opal she had done well for herself, which was the most emotional thing anyone had ever heard him say. Hector Crane, the man who Ruth had warned her gossiped like a church organist, stood in the corner and watched everything with the satisfied expression of a man storing material, and Opal thought this was fine, because what he had to store was only good. Isaiah danced with her twice, and the second time he held her closer than the first and bent his head down to speak near her ear, and what he said was not something she would repeat to anyone, but it made her laugh and hold him tighter, and it was, she thought, the beginning of the particular and private language that belonged only to the 2 of them. They went to the ranch that night, the 2 of them in the wagon under a sky that was impossibly full of stars, and the land was silver and still under the winter cold, and the horse's breath made clouds in the air. Isaiah drove with one hand on the reins and one hand covering hers on the seat between them, and they rode in silence because the silence between them had always been easy, had always been its own conversation. When they came through the gate, she looked at the gate post, her name in the starlight. She leaned her head against his shoulder and felt his arm move around her. "I suppose," she said, "that you could carve one more thing on that post." "What would that be?" he said. "Isaiah Norris," she said, "under my name." He was quiet for a moment. Then he said, "I thought about doing that before you arrived. I thought it would be too forward." "It would have been," she said, "but now it is just accurate." He brought the wagon into the yard and helped her down, and Clara had left lights on in the house and a fire burning in the main room, and the ranch house was warm and lit and smelled of the dinner Clara had left on the back of the stove. And Opal Baker Norris stood in the doorway of her new home and looked at all of it. The wide rooms, the solid walls, the fire, the light, the land outside the window going on forever under the stars, and this man standing behind her. She turned around and looked at Isaiah. "Well," she said. "Well," he said, and that was enough. In the spring, Opal established herself in the ranch with the same practicality she brought to everything. She organized the house with an efficiency that Clara respected and occasionally marveled at aloud. She expanded the kitchen garden, adding beds for vegetables that Ruth had told her did well in the Kansas soil. She took on sewing work from the women of Caldwell and nearby homesteads because she liked the work, and because the income was not nothing, and because she found that having a trade of her own, a skill that was entirely hers, was important to her sense of herself. She also, in the evenings when the light was still good, began to use the carving tools Isaiah had given her. She was not skilled at first. She made shapes that were rough and unconvincing, and she cut her thumb twice in the first week. But she was patient and she had good hands, and by the time the spring grass was fully up and the cattle were on the new pasture, she was producing work that was recognizable and pleasing. She carved a wooden box for Ruth's birthday, with a pattern of wild grasses and meadowlarks on the lid. Ruth cried when she opened it, which Opal accepted with grace. She carved a small horse for baby James, smooth and simple, which he carried around in his fist for months before he lost it in the creek and wept inconsolably. And one morning in April, while Isaiah was out working the south pasture with Eli and old Pete, she took a good knife and went to the gate post at the north entrance, and she carved, below her own name, in letters that were careful and deep, Isaiah Norris. She stepped back and looked at it. Their names together on the post, her name in his hands and his name in hers. She felt the symmetry of it, the completion of something that had been half finished for a year. When he came in at noon and unsaddled his horse and came up to the house for dinner, she said casually, "You might look at the gate post when you go back out." He looked at her. His expression told her he understood something was there, and she watched him ride out after dinner and pull his horse up at the gate and get down and stand at the post for a long moment. When he came back in the evening, he did not say anything about it immediately. He washed up and sat down to supper and talked about the cattle and the weather, and Opal let him have this. Let him carry it quietly the way she had carried the original carvings, finding them one by one, turning them over in her heart before speaking. After supper, when Clara had gone home and the house was theirs, he sat beside her on the bench on the porch in the warm April evening, and he took her hand and held it and said nothing for a long time. Then he said, "You carved my name." "I did," she said. "It is good," he said. "Your carving is good." "Better than yours?" she asked. "Different than mine," he said diplomatically. She laughed and leaned against him and felt his arm go around her, and they sat in the evening with the frogs beginning in the creek, and the first stars coming up in the east, and everything was very good. The summer of 1875 brought a dry spell that worried the ranchers and farmers in the territory, and Isaiah spent more days than usual riding the fence lines and checking the water sources, making sure the stock had enough to drink, moving the cattle to the better grass. Opal watched him absorb the worry of this with the same steady quality he brought to everything, taking it seriously but not breaking under it. She heard, through the network of information that flowed through Caldwell's Main Street and the church circuit, and the conversations that happened at the general store, that some of the other ranchers in the territory were in harder trouble than Isaiah, particularly those who had overextended themselves or who had poorer water sources. 2 homesteaders south of town had already given up and moved on. She knew that Isaiah's situation was better managed, that he had been careful and thoughtful, but she also knew that the dry weather was something no amount of management could fully counter. One evening in July, she was sitting with him on the porch after supper, and she said, "Tell me what you need." He looked at her. "What do you mean?" "This summer, the dry weather. Tell me what is the actual situation." He was quiet for a moment, and she thought he might deflect, might give her the reassuring version, but he did not. He told her straight. The well was holding but lower than he would like. The south pasture grass was thin. He would need to move the cattle to the north sections earlier than usual, which would put pressure on that grass. If the dry spell continued past August, he would need to consider selling some of the herd earlier than planned and at lower prices than he would normally accept. He had the funds to weather a bad year, but a second bad year would be tighter. She listened to all of this. When he finished, she said, "What can I do?" "You are not a rancher," he said, not unkindly. "No," she said, "but I am your wife and this is my ranch too. What can I do that would help?" He looked at her for a moment. "The sewing work," he said carefully. "The income from that, it is more than I expected." "I can take on more," she said. Mrs. Harland at the dry goods store asked me last week if I would do the ready-made alterations for items they stock. It would be regular work. "Opal," he said. "It makes sense," she said. "I like the work. We need the income to be sure. Let me do this." He looked at her with an expression she had come to know as one of the ones she loved most, the one where he was moved by something and was trying to be equal to it. "I will not tell you that you do not need to," he said. "That would be foolish and also not what you want to hear." "It would be both," she agreed. "I am grateful," he said. "We are partners," she said. "That is all." He brought her hand to his mouth and pressed his lips against her knuckles, and the evening continued in the warmth of that. The summer got drier before it got better, but it did get better. A good rain came in late August, 2 days of steady rain that brought the grass back and the well level up, and the whole territory seemed to exhale. Opal heard that 3 ranchers to the south had not made it, had sold or abandoned their places, and she thought of this with genuine sorrow and with an awareness of how close the edge always was out here, how the land gave generously and could take back with equal generosity. That autumn, she realized she was expecting a child. She told Isaiah on a Sunday morning in September, while they were sitting in the kitchen with their coffee before Clara arrived, the house quiet around them. She told him straight, because that was how she told him everything. He set down his coffee cup. He looked at her. Something moved through his face that was so much larger than his usual careful expressions that it was almost disorienting, a full, wide joy that he did not try to control or moderate. He got up from the table and came around to her side and crouched beside her chair and took her hands and looked up at her, and he said, "You are sure?" "I am sure," she said. He put his forehead against their joined hands and was quiet for a moment that she felt throughout her entire body. "I am," he started and stopped. "I know," she said. He looked up at her. His dark eyes were bright. "We are going to need to think about the second room," he said, which made her laugh out loud. "Yes," she said, "we probably are." Ruth's reaction was everything Opal had expected, which was to say it was enormous and warm, and involved a great deal of planning for things that did not need to happen for months yet. Thomas shook Isaiah's hand with the particular expression of men who have agreed that this is a very good development and are not going to make a fuss, but are going to feel the rightness of it very deeply. The baby came in May of 1876, on a morning when the prairie was in full flower, and the light was the long gold of a Kansas spring. It was a difficult enough labor that Dr. Haynes from Caldwell was summoned and arrived on horseback in the middle of the night, and Isaiah spent most of those hours in the kitchen with Eli and old Pete and Thomas, who had all arrived at various points in the night out of what they claimed were various practical reasons, but were clearly nothing more than the need to be near. Clara managed the birth with Dr. Haynes, and Opal, who had not been under any illusion that it would be easy, found the difficulty more than matched by the clarity of purpose that came with it, that particular ferocious focus of a woman doing the most important work of her body. The child arrived at dawn, as the first light was breaking over the flat land and the meadowlarks were starting in the grass, and Clara brought the baby to Opal and said, "A boy. He is good and strong." Isaiah was brought in, and he stood at the side of the bed and looked at his wife and his son, with the expression that Opal had been keeping in her heart like a lamp since the evening on the porch of his ranch when she had first understood what he was, that expression of a man who has arrived somewhere he has always needed to be, and she held the baby up and said, "Come and meet him." He sat on the edge of the bed and she put the baby in his arms, and Isaiah held his son with the careful, deliberate attention he brought to everything, and looked at this new person, and then looked at Opal and said, "What shall we call him?" They had talked about names for months, they had lists. They had argued about some of them pleasantly the way people who communicate well argue about things. "William," Opal said, "for your father." Isaiah was quiet for a moment. He looked at the baby. He looked at Opal. "William," he said, and the way he said it was the way he had said her name on the porch of Thomas's house that first evening, with full weight. William Norris had his father's dark eyes and his mother's serious expression from the very beginning, which made Clara say he was going to be exactly like both of them, which she meant as the highest praise. The ranch and the years settled into a life that was full and layered. The dry summer of 1875 had been followed by better years, and the herd grew, and Isaiah expanded the north pasture and took on a third hand, a young man named Marcus who had come up from Texas with nothing but a good horse and a willingness to work, and who became, over time, part of the fabric of the place. Opal's sewing work had become well established enough that she had regular orders from 2 towns, not just Caldwell, but also from Medicine Lodge to the south, and she had trained a young woman from Caldwell named Bess to assist her, which freed up time while also giving Bess a livelihood of her own, which Opal considered a double satisfaction. She and Isaiah had found their rhythm, the way people do when they have built something together over years, a rhythm that was not repetitive but that had its own texture and predictability, and within that predictability, its own surprises and its own small daily discoveries. He still did not talk a great deal, but what he said still meant what he said, and she still thought before she spoke, and between them there was a quality of understanding that she had not expected to find, and that she considered the central wealth of her life. They had their arguments. Every life and every marriage had its arguments, and theirs were occasional and real, and not about nothing. They argued once, seriously, about whether to take on a business arrangement with a cattle broker in Wichita that Opal thought was risky, and Isaiah wanted to try. The argument lasted 3 days and was unpleasant in the way that honest disagreements between two people who are both right about different aspects of a problem can be unpleasant. She thought the contract terms were bad. He thought the relationship with the broker would be worth the risk. In the end, they negotiated a modified arrangement that was closer to her position than his, and the broker turned out to be slightly less reliable than Isaiah had believed, and slightly less ruinous than Opal had feared, and they looked at each other afterward and agreed that they had both been partly right, which was the only honest conclusion. She found in the years after that this was a thing she valued about him greatly, this capacity to agree that he had been partly wrong without it diminishing him in his own eyes or in hers. It was a quality she had not thought to look for before she found it, but once she had it she could not imagine being without it. William grew, as children do, with a speed that was simultaneously expected and astonishing. He walked before he was 1 and talked before he was 2, and by the time he was 3, he was following his father around the ranch with an expression of absolute concentrated purpose, studying the horses and the cattle and the fence lines, and the water sources with the same careful attention his father brought to them. Isaiah taught him the names of things with patience, the proper names, what the tools were called and what the parts of the animals were called, and what the different grasses were called. And Opal listened to these lessons from across the yard or through the kitchen window, and felt a love so complete and specific that it sometimes stopped her in the middle of whatever she was doing. She was expecting their second child by the time William was 3, and this pregnancy was easier than the first, or at least she knew what she was dealing with. And when the second baby arrived in the autumn of 1879, it was a girl, quick and loud, with her mother's green eyes and a temperament that announced itself immediately. They named her Eleanor after Opal's mother. Eleanor Rose Norris came into the world with the particular energy of a person who had somewhere to be and things to accomplish, and this did not change as she grew. She was bright and fast and talked constantly from the moment she learned how and had opinions about everything, which delighted Opal and slightly overwhelmed Isaiah, who loved her completely and was also sometimes unsure what to do when she directed her full personality at him. "She is you," he said to Opal one evening, watching Eleanor in the yard arguing with a fence post about something. "She is not me," Opal said. "She is what you would have been if you had not learned to wait before speaking," he said. This was so accurate that Opal could not argue with it. By 1880, the Norris ranch had settled into the kind of solidity that took years to build. It was not wealthy in the way that cities defined wealth, but it was rich in the ways that mattered, in land and stock and good work and good people, and a family that filled the rooms with purpose and noise. Thomas and Ruth's homestead had grown into a proper farm, and their own children, James and a later daughter named Clara after the cook, came to the ranch often and were part of the extended life of the place. Clara Beckett retired from cooking for Isaiah at the age of 62, declaring that she had fed men long enough and was going to spend her remaining years feeding herself whatever she liked. She moved into town but came to Sunday dinner at the ranch every week for years, because the ranch and its people had become her own, and she was not going to give that up simply because her employment had ended. Old Pete continued working the ranch past the age when most men would have stopped, because as he explained it, he did not know what else he would do with himself, and the truth was that nobody wanted him to stop. He developed a particular fondness for young Eleanor that was touching in a man of his economy of expression, and Eleanor, who had no patience for anyone she considered dull, found him endlessly interesting, and could be found sitting beside him during his dinner breaks, listening to stories from the cattle drives of the 1860s that were probably partly true. In the late summer of 1881, Isaiah rode the fence lines as he did every season, checking the posts, checking the wire, looking for wear and damage, and he came back one afternoon and found Opal in the kitchen and said, without particular preamble, "The carvings are fading." She looked up from the bread she was making. "Which carvings?" He looked at her with a look that said clearly which carvings. She wiped her hands on her apron. She knew the carvings he meant. 7 fence posts and the gate post with both their names. 6 years of weather and wind and sun and frost had been working on them. "Some of them will need to be recut," he said, "or new posts set." She thought about this. She thought about the first time she had seen her name on a fence post, stepping out of the stagecoach on a dusty Kansas road, thinking she had imagined it. She thought about finding them one by one, carrying the knowledge quietly and carefully, like something too good to spill. "We could cut them together," she said. "I have better technique now than when I started." He looked at her for a moment. "You want to recut them?" "Not all of them," she said, "but the gate post. Our names together on the gate post, that one I want to cut again." He was quiet for a moment, then he said, "We could add something." "What would you add?" "The year," he said. "The year we were married and the year of William and the year of Alina." She looked at him. He had been thinking about this, she realized, before he brought it up. This was not an idle idea. He had been thinking about the gate post and what it should hold, what the record of their life should look like in the wood. "Yes," she said. "We should add all of that." They did it on a Sunday afternoon in September when the weather was fine and the children were occupied. William with his lessons at the kitchen table and Alina, at 2 years old, asleep in her crib. They walked out to the gate together, Isaiah with his good knife and Opal with hers, and they stood in front of the post that had held their names since before they were married, since before she arrived, since the beginning of all of this. The original letters were still legible but softened by the years. Isaiah began with the deeper cuts, his hands sure and practiced, the letters of their names going deep into the fresh-cut wood beneath the weathered surface. Opal worked beside him, adding the dates, her carving steady and clean. They worked in comfortable silence for a long time, side by side in the September light, 2 people carving the record of their life into wood that would last longer than they would, and Opal felt the circle of it, the completion, the way this moment answered the moment she had stood alone in this gate opening 6 years ago with both hands on the post and her eyes closed, and the creek running in the distance. When they were done, they stood back and looked at what the post held. Opal Baker Norris, Isaiah Norris, married February 14, 1875, William born May 1876, Alina born October 1879. It was not a poem. It was not a speech. It was just the bare record, names and dates, carved into the post at the entrance to the land they had built together, and it was everything. Isaiah stood beside her and she leaned into his side and his arm came around her and they looked at the post for a long time. "We should put the ranch name on there too," she said. "We do not have a ranch name," he said. "We should give it one." He considered this. "What would you call it?" She thought about the meadowlark that she had heard every morning that first spring, the sound of it rising out of the grass before the sun was fully up, that clear rising song that was the sound of this place for her. The sound of the mornings when she had walked and found her name in the wood and begun to understand that she was home. "The Meadowlark," she said. He thought about it. "The Meadowlark Ranch." "Yes, I like it," he said. She felt his arm tighten around her and she turned her face up to his and he kissed her. There in the gateway of the ranch, with the September sky wide and blue above them and the grass moving in the long slow waves it always moved in, and the cattle in the south pasture making their sounds, and the faint noise of William doing his lessons drifting out from the kitchen window, and everything was exactly and entirely what it was. He added the name below the rest of the carving, clean and careful. The Meadowlark Ranch. She stepped back and looked at all of it together, the whole record on the post, and she said to him quietly, You know what I thought the first time I saw my name on one of these posts? Tell me, he said. I thought I had imagined it. I told myself it was a coincidence that there were other Opal Bakers in the world. There may be, he said. Not that you were thinking of, she said. No, he said. Not that I was thinking of. She turned to him fully and looked at his face. This face she knew better now than her own in the mirror, this careful and devoted and quietly extraordinary face. I am glad you did it, she said. I am glad you rode those roads and carved those posts. I am glad you did not write a letter or send a formal arrangement through a broker or any other sensible way of doing things. I am glad you did the unreasonable, beautiful thing. He looked at her with those dark eyes and said, I could not think of any other way to say it, that I wanted you here, that I wanted you to be real on this land. I am real on this land, she said. You are, he said. You are the realest thing on it. She had heard him say this before, on that winter evening years ago, but it landed now with the added weight of everything that had accumulated between them. The years and the children and the ranch and the arguments and the good years and the hard years and all of it. And she felt it in her chest and her throat and her eyes. And she did not cry, because she was not in the habit of it, but she stood very close to him and held his hand and let the feeling be what it was. The ranch settled into its autumn rhythms after that, the cattle drives and the hay and the preparation for winter, and life continued in all its full and complex and irreplaceable particulars. William turned 5 that fall and had taken to following old Pete around with the same determination he had once directed at his father, absorbing everything the old man was willing to teach and asking questions about everything else. Eleanor, at 2, had already established that she would be running something someday and had simply not yet decided what. Opal sat in the kitchen that November evening, after the children were in bed and the house was quiet, and Isaiah was writing at the table, his record of the herd counts and the expenses in the ledger he kept, and she was working on a piece of embroidery for a woman in Medicine Lodge, and the fire was going, and the lamp was burning, and outside the wind was moving over the grass with its particular low sound. She looked at him across the table, his head bent over the ledger, his hand moving the pen in the neat, careful lines he wrote in, and she thought about the fence posts. She thought about the gate post with their names on it, with the full record of what had grown from that original act of quiet devotion, those 7 fence posts carved in the mornings before she arrived, her name in the wood of a land that was not yet hers. She thought about what Ruth had written in her letter, years ago now. Come out here, Opal. There is more sky than you have ever seen in your life. There was. There was more sky than she had ever seen, and more land and more light and more wind and more work, and more of everything that mattered. There was a man who had loved her in advance, in the only language he fully trusted, in work done with his hands on the things that were permanent. There was a life built on a land that now held their names and their children's names, and the name they had given the place itself, carved into the wood of the gate post where anyone who came down the north road could see it, where the meadowlark sang every morning before the sun was fully up, where she had arrived one September afternoon with her trunk and her serious eyes and her sense of purpose she had not entirely figured out yet. She had figured it out now. She looked at Isaiah and felt the warmth and the certainty and the deep gladness of it. He looked up from the ledger and caught her watching him. What is it? He said. Nothing, she said. And then, after a beat, everything. He held her gaze for a moment, and she saw in his eyes the same thing she felt, that complete recognition, that arriving. He reached across the table and covered her hand with his, briefly, warmly, the way he had done 1,000 times before and would do 1,000 times again. Everything, he agreed. Outside, the wind moved the grass over the wide, dark land, and the stars burned clear and cold above the Meadowlark Ranch. And inside the warm and well-lit house, the fire kept its steady work, and 2 people sat in the particular silence of people who have found in each other the reason they were looking for, and were content. In the spring that followed, when the land greened again, and the meadowlarks returned to their posts in the grass, and William was tall enough to sit a horse by himself with his father beside him. Opal walked the north road one morning in the early light and stopped at each fence post she passed. The carvings were still there, most of them, her name in his hand, weathered but legible, the record of a man's quiet and extraordinary devotion pressed into the substance of the land. She had never told anyone outside the family about them, about what they meant, about the full story of finding them one by one through her first weeks in Kansas, carrying the knowledge quietly until she was ready to speak. She thought sometimes that this was the most intimate thing in her life, not private in the sense of hidden, since the carvings were there on every fence post for anyone to see, but private in the sense of belonging entirely and specifically to the two of them, a conversation that had begun before they met, and that continued in the work of their days and the texture of their life. She reached the seventh post, the one on the south road near the creek crossing, and she stopped and put her hand on it as she had done on other mornings, palm over the carved letters, and she stood in the early light with the creek moving and the birds beginning and the day opening up around her. Opal Baker. Her name in his hands, carved into this land before she was here, because he had heard she was coming and had needed to do something with it, had needed to make her real before she arrived. She was real. She was as real as the land and the light and the creek and the carved wood under her palm. She was as real as the children sleeping in the house and the man who would be up shortly and out to the barn, moving through his morning with his usual deliberate care. She was as real as the 7 years they had built together, and the name they had given the ranch and the record on the gate post and all of it, the full weight of a life that had turned on an act of quiet love on a fence post on a Kansas road. She lifted her hand from the wood and turned and walked back along the road toward home, into the morning that was opening above the wide gold land, and the meadowlark sang its clear rising song from somewhere in the grass, and she walked toward the smoke rising from the ranch house chimney, and the sound of her children waking and the day that was hers, and was full of everything she had ever needed.